Happy Wednesday, Bio 47. Today I'm going over Lab 13. That's the skeletal muscle of the upper extremity or the upper limb. These are muscles that are responsible for moving the arm by adjusting the position of the shoulder joint. Muscles that are responsible for moving the forearm by adjusting the position of the elbow joint. And muscles that move the hand by adjusting the position of the wrist and the fingers. For all of these muscles, you're going to want to be able to locate the muscles of the upper limb, know their origin and their insertion, and know their primary action. So I'm going to start with the muscles of the shoulder, the arm movers. These are muscles that are originating from the scapula, and they're providing support and mobility for that relatively weak shoulder joint. And collectively, these muscles are called the rotator cuff muscles. Not all of them have a rotating action, but all of them have tendons that encapsulate the head of the humerus, and they form this tendinous cuff around the head of the humerus. And that's why they're called the rotator cuff muscles. An abbreviation to remember the rotator cuff muscles is SITS, S-I-T-S, and then you'll remember the four rotator cuff muscles: supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. The first one, supraspinatus, is in the supraspinous fossa. That's both its origin and the location of the muscle belly. Its insertion is on the greater tubercle of the humerus, and it serves to abduct the humerus. So it's a tendon that's broad and flat and forms the superior part of the cuff around the head of the humerus. The next one, infraspinatus, has its origin in the infraspinous fossa. That's also where the muscle belly is, as its insertion on the greater tubercle of the humerus, and its action is to laterally rotate the humerus. The tendon is making up the posterior cuff of the humerus. Next is teres minor, which originates along the inferior and lateral border of the scapula, and it inserts on the greater tubercle of the humerus. So this is also forming part of that posterior cuff and contributing to lateral rotation of the humerus. The last one is subscapularis. Subscapularis is in the subscapular fossa. That's its origin and the location of the muscle belly. So it's hidden beneath the scapula. That's why you can only see it in this anterior view over here. The tendon makes part of that anterior cuff of the glenohumeral joint, and its action is to medially rotate the humerus. The next muscle of the shoulder is teres major, which originates at the inferior angle of the scapula. So we're back to a posterior view here. And in this posterior view, you can see up here, infraspinatus, or supraspinatus, sorry, and infraspinatus here, and teres minor here, and then down below it, teres major. Teres major has its origin at the inferior angle of the scapula, and it inserts on the humerus at the margin of the intertubercular groove. So it passes over to the anterior humerus, so it causes medial rotation. It's not a rotator cuff muscle, it's too inferior. Its insertion is down here on the humerus, so it's not forming part of that rotator cuff. The action of teres major is extension of the humerus, adduction, and medial rotation. So all three of those are its primary action. That is extension, adduction, and medial rotation. The next muscle of the shoulder is the deltoid muscle. The deltoid muscle is a big tripennate muscle that's capping the shoulder. So it's tripennate with a wide origin across the clavicle and the scapula. That includes the spine and the acromion of the scapula. And then it converges inferiorly to its insertion on the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. So it wraps over the shoulder and it forms the cap of the shoulder. Its primary action is abduction of the humerus, pulling on that deltoid tuberosity, moving the humerus upward and outward. But because it has this tripennate arrangement, when different fascicles are operating, then you can get different actions. So if the anterior group, shown here in red, contracts, then it can flex the humerus of the shoulder. The posterior group, also known as the rear delts, can serve as a shoulder extensor. So it can have some diverse functions due to that tripennate arrangement. And now I'm moving into the muscles of the arm. These are the muscles that surround the humerus, and they're the muscles that are responsible for moving the arm, moving the forearm. The one that's most superficial and very prominent is the biceps brachii. So biceps, two heads, and in the brachial region, biceps brachii. The short head originates at the coracoid process of the scapula, so that's right here. And the long head travels up to the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula. Both of these heads share an insertion on the radial tuberosity and the fascia over the ulna. So because the long head crosses over that shoulder joint to originate at the supraglenoid tubercle, then it can participate in flexion at the shoulder, and both heads participate in flexing the forearm at the elbow. Biceps brachii can also play a minor role in supination at that radio-ulnar joint, so the movement of the forearm, supination. The primary action of biceps brachii is flexion of the forearm at the elbow. If you were to remove biceps brachii, which is what's been done on the right side here, to get a look at some of these deeper muscles of the arm, you'd see two muscles that are each doing half of what biceps brachii does. So coracobrachialis, as its name implies, it originates at the coracoid process of the scapula and travels in the brachial region, and then it inserts on the medial aspect of the shaft of the humerus. So coracobrachialis only crosses the shoulder joint, so it can only cause movement at the shoulder joint, where it adducts the humerus and flexes the shoulder. Then it runs next to the short head of biceps brachii. And right about where coracobrachialis has its insertion, this is where another muscle, brachialis, has its origin. So it originates about halfway down the humerus, and it inserts on the ulna. It's covering the shaft of the humerus here, so it's deep to biceps brachii, and this one only crosses the elbow, so brachialis can only contribute to flexion of the forearm at the elbow. So biceps brachii can flex the shoulder and flex the forearm because it crosses both joints. Coracobrachialis only crosses the shoulder, so it can only cause movement at the shoulder, and brachialis only crosses the elbow, so it can only cause movement at the elbow. In the posterior side of the brachial region, it's just one big tri-headed muscle. That's the triceps brachii. So over here on the left, we're looking at a posterior view, and the big deltoid is sort of faded out so that you can see that it covers the heads of triceps brachii. So three heads, triceps brachii in the brachial region. The long head originates on the scapula at that infraglenoid tubercle. So the long head crosses the shoulder joint and can cause movement at the shoulder joint. And the other two heads originate on the humerus, the lateral head and the medial head. And it's difficult to see the medial head unless the lateral head has been cut. So that's what's being illustrated on the right here, is the lateral head has been cut to show the origin of the medial head. So the Triceps brachii has origin points on the scapula at the infraglenoid tubercle and on the shaft of the humerus for the long and the lateral heads, or the lateral and the medial heads. The long head is what separates teres minor and teres major. All three of these origins converge on a single insertion point on the olecranon of the ulna. So there's this really big, wide, flat tendon. We're going to call it a tendon, even though it sort of looks like an aponeurosis, a big, white, flat tendon on the posterior surface of the brachial region. That's the insertion tendon of triceps brachii. Because one of the heads crosses the shoulder joint, its action contributes to extension at the shoulder, but only with 1/3 of the strength that biceps brachii has. Triceps brachii, I'm going to get this right. The other two heads only cross the elbow joint, and they can only contribute to extension of the forearm at the elbow. That's triceps brachii on the posterior surface. Now moving down into the muscles of the forearm. The muscles of the forearm can be tricky because a lot of them look really similar and there are a lot of them. So it's important to get familiar with some landmarks that you can keep track of. And one of these landmarks is brachioradialis. It's going to be a big, prominent muscle belly. It's right next to brachialis. And it separates the anterior compartment of the arm from the posterior compartment of the arm. So brachioradialis has its origin on the humerus, on that lateral epicondyle, and its insertion on the styloid process of the radius. So it doesn't cross the wrist, and it contributes to flexion of the forearm at the elbow. So now we're looking at the anterior forearm. And on this anterior surface is where we're going to find flexors, muscles that reduce the angle at a joint. So these are all going to be flexors with a couple of exceptions. So here's brachioradialis, which is on the radial side, the thumb side. And here's the insertion of biceps brachii on that radial tuberosity. And then moving from lateral to medial, there's a group of 1, 2, 3, 4 muscles in the superficial compartment of the anterior forearm. The first one, shown in teal here, is pronator teres. Pronator teres has this really distinct oblique orientation. So it's running oblique, whereas a lot of these muscles of the forearm are running parallel to the orientation of the bone. So a pronator teres has this oblique orientation. It has its origin on the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and its insertion on the distal lateral surface of the radius. It's responsible for pronating the forearm, turning the radius and the ulna past each other, that unique movement that's possible at the forearm. If you have a pronator, then you know that you have to have a supinator. There is one supinator, but it's difficult to see. It's deep within the forearm, so we're not going to learn about where you find the supinator, but know that the supinator is there. The next one is flexor carpi radialis. Flexor carpi radialis is a flexor of the wrist. That's where it gets its name. So flexor, flexes, carpi, the wrist, and has a tendon that runs parallel to the radius, so radialis. Flexor carpi radialis, shown in pink there. It has its origin on the medial epicondyle of the humerus and in its insertion at metacarpals 2 and 3. So it's responsible for flexing the wrist, and because it's on the radial side, it can also abduct the wrist, move the wrist away from the midline. The next one in the superficial compartment is palmaris longus. Palmaris longus is a small, spindly muscle. It often hides. It's a flexor of the wrist. It originates also at the medial epicondyle, and it inserts at the palmar aponeurosis and the flexor retinaculum. Those are those thick connective tissues of the wrist and the hand. Palmaris longus is absent in maybe 10% of the population. It's a muscle that we don't really need. It doesn't affect your grip strength or your arm strength if palmaris longus is absent. And the last of this superficial compartment is flexor carpi ulnaris. This is again a flexor of the wrist, flexor carpi, and the tendon runs parallel to the ulna. So it's ulnaris. It has its origin on the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and it has its insertion down at the carpal bones and metacarpal 5. So it flexes the wrist, and because it's on the ulnar side, when it contracts, it can adduct the wrist. Flexor carpi ulnaris is really more medial than it is anterior. It's way off to the side, and it's going to be visible from the posterior aspect as well. So that's the superficial compartment of the anterior forearm. But let's go deep to that. In the middle compartment of the forearm, there's just one muscle. This is flexor digitorum superficialis. And this flexor digitorum superficialis originates on the medial epicondyle of the humerus and has its insertion down at the middle phalange of fingers 2 through 5. So it's responsible for flexion of the wrist and flexion of the fingers to the middle phalanx. It is in the middle compartment, so it's underneath pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, and flexor carpi ulnaris. It's going to be most visible underneath that palmaris longus tendon. And at its insertion, it splits into 4 different tendons that travel to fingers 2, 3, 4, and 5 to be able to flex those fingers. In the deep compartment, there are 2 muscles that you need to know about. And these are ones that wouldn't be easy to see on the cadavers or on models because they're obscured by that superficial compartment and by flexor digitorum superficialis in the middle compartment. So this is the deep compartment of the anterior forearm. The first one is flexor digitorum profundus. This is deep to flexor digitorum superficialis. It has its origin on the ulna and on the interosseous membrane, and its insertion down at the distal phalanges of fingers 2 through 5. So flexor digitorum superficialis could only flex the middle phalanx. Flexor digitorum profundus can flex that digital phalanx. And this is on the more medial side. This one also splits into 4 tendons that travel to fingers 2 through 5. There's another muscle that's responsible for flexing the thumb, and that one's flexor pollicis longus. Remember, the pollex is the thumb. This originates on the anterior shaft of the radius and on the interosseous membrane that bind the radius and the ulna together. It's responsible for flexing the thumb, flexing the pollex. And this is going to be on the lateral side. So starting to put the pieces together, here we're looking at an anterior view of the brachial region and the antebrachial region. So you can see the big biceps brachii, letting you know that you're on the anterior side, and a little bit of triceps brachii is visible from that posterior compartment. Brachialis, remember, is that one that only does half of what biceps brachii does. It just crosses the elbow and causes flexion at the elbow. Running right next to brachialis is brachioradialis. which causes flexion at the elbow. And it's going to be that big muscle belly that divides the anterior compartment with flexors from the posterior compartment with extensors. And we just talked about the anterior compartment with pronator teres, the muscle that pronates and has that oblique orientation, flexor carpi radialis, which causes flexion at the wrist, as well as abduction of the wrist, palmaris longus, the one that's a wrist flexor and absent in some people, and flexor carpi ulnaris, which is more lateral than it is anterior, and that's what's illustrated here. And deep to those, you can see flexor digitorum superficialis. Underneath that would be flexor digitorum profundus, and you get just a little view of this muscle of the deep compartment, flexor pollicis longus, that's responsible for flexing the thumb. It's on the lateral side. The flexor digitorum muscles are on that more medial side. So let's look at this posterior side that's getting hinted at over here with the extensor muscles. On this posterior side, again, you can see brachioradialis, that's that big muscle belly that's going to be dividing flexors and extensors. And then if you go in a sequence from lateral to medial across the posterior forearm, here's what you're going to see. The first one is extensor carpi radialis longus, and right next to it, extensor carpi radialis brevis. Extensor carpi radialis longus originates more proximally, so it's longer. Extensor carpi radialis brevis originates more distally, and that makes it shorter. They both originate on the humerus and insert down at metacarpals 2 and 3. So they're extensors of the wrist, extensor carpi, and they travel parallel to the radius, radialis, and one of them's long and one of them short, so longus and brevis. If you kept moving across the posterior forearm, you get to extensor digitorum. Extensor digitorum originates on the humerus and inserts down at phalanges 2 through 5, and it serves to extend those phalanges. Extensor digiti minimi is a little spindly muscle that's traveling right next to that. It serves to just extend finger number 5. And I don't think that one's on your list, but it's a fun one. And last but not least is extensor carpi ulnaris. Extensor carpi ulnaris originates on the humerus at the lateral epicondyle and extends down to metacarpal 5. It serves to extend and to adduct the wrist because it's on that medial side. So I know it's a lot, but I think that the forearm muscles are really fun to practice just on your own. So if you can figure out where they are on you, that might help with some of this 3-dimensional imaging and trying to figure out where exactly these muscles are in relation to each other. So definitely play with the visible body simulations, but I think that you can also practice with identifying the muscles on yourself. So let me see what I can do here. So what you can do is practice looking at your own muscles and try to figure out if you can deduce the location and actions of some of these muscles. So I'm not going to go over the rotator cuff muscles, but I'll start with the deltoid. This big cap over the shoulder is the deltoid. It's primarily responsible for abduction of the humerus at the shoulder, but can also contribute to extension and flexion if those other muscle fibers are working. In the anterior compartment of the brachial region, you have the big prominent biceps brachii that's primarily elbow flexion, but can also do shoulder flexion. The coracobrachialis only does shoulder flexion. That's from the coracoid process to the brachial region. From the brachial region down to the antebrachial region, that's brachialis, that only contributes to flexion at the elbow. In the posterior compartment, triceps brachii, that's responsible for extending the arm at the elbow. And with only one of the three heads, extension at the shoulder. Then down in the forearm, you get into some of these really fun muscles. So this really big muscle belly right here that you can see on the lateral side, this one that you can flex and really show off, that one is brachioradialis. That's responsible for elbow flexion and divides the anterior and the posterior compartments. So brachioradialis is that dividing line. Then in the anterior compartment, remember that you had 4 superficial muscles. You can remember these in order by taking your thumb and putting it on your medial epicondyle, and then sort of splaying your fingers out like this. So brachioradialis is up here, and starting with your index finger, just remember pass, fail, pass, fail. P, F, P, F. The first P with that oblique orientation is pronator teres. Pronator teres lets you pronate. The next one, F, that's flexor carpi radialis. Flexor carpi radialis is on the radial side, so it helps with not just flexion of the wrist, but abduction. Next one, palmaris longus. That's a wrist flexor, absent in some people. And then flexor carpi ulnaris is the second F, and it's that muscle that contributes to wrist flexion as well as wrist adduction. And it's more on the lateral side here, or more on the side here. That would be the medial side. Deep to that, if you are somebody who has really beefy forearms, maybe you do a lot of rock climbing, or you're a tennis player, you have really strong fingers, then you might be able to see flexor digitorum superficialis moving around in that middle compartment of the forearm. So that'd be flexor digitorum superficialis. Too deep to see would be flexor digitorum profundus on the medial side, and flexor pollicis longus on the lateral side. So that's the anterior compartment of the forearm. To get into the posterior compartment, get your bearings again, find brachioradialis, and it's moving around under the skin there. That big muscle belly is likely brachioradialis, plus, moving around to the back, extensor carpi radialis longus. The next one's gotta be extensor carpi radialis brevis. Keep moving around, you get to, it's wiggling around under the skin there, extensor digitorum, that extends the fingers. Then there's a little spindly one that you don't need to know, but that is extensor digiti minimi. It extends the 5th finger. And then you get to extensor carpi ulnaris. If you kept going from extensor carpi ulnaris and you came back around this side, where would you be? You'd be at flexor carpi ulnaris. So don't stress out too much about the muscles of the forearm. If you have to take a wild guess about what muscle of the forearm you're looking at, don't lose your head. It's probably a flexor if it's on this side, the anterior side, probably an extensor if it's on this side. If it's a flexor or an extensor, it's probably followed by carpi, moving the wrist, and then try to figure out, is it on the radial side, radialis, or the ulnar side, ulnaris. So all of them over here, flexor, carpi, something. Over here, extensor, carpi, something. Unless it's in the middle, I guess, in which case it might be a digitorum. But, you know, whatever helps you. So I hope that my flexing on camera helped you learn some things about the muscles of the arm